Good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. And yes, we're here with our first session of Grow's Nurture series, where we invite multidisciplinary thought leaders to deliver talks that expand your thinking about agri-food innovation and the future of food. We're excited that you can join us today. My name is John Friedman. I'm the Director of AgFunder Asia, based in Singapore, as well as the Grow Accelerator. And today we are joined by Armen Harutyunyan. Armen is the Senior Advisor at the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. And Armen will be talking to us today about innovating for regional food security. Prior to taking up his role at UNDP in Singapore, Armen served 5 years as the Deputy Minister for Agriculture of Armenia and has received awards for his contributions to the formation of the Eurasian Economic Union, as well as investment into the development of Armenian agriculture. Perhaps his proudest achievement has been awarded the medal for Best Defensive Player in the Inter-Ministerial Soccer League, but I'll let Armen talk about more of that himself. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Armen. Armen, thanks again for being with us today.
Hi everyone, I'm very glad and delighted to be here today and to speak to you about the food security and how to use innovation to address the food security on the local and regional levels. So we live in times of uncertainty and dynamic change, and it requires businesses to be more agile, flexible, and most importantly, innovative. And therefore today I'm going to speak about how to use these technologies and what are the technologies that are driving or helping us to be more food sustainable and to be more food secured. And let me start with a very simple definition of food security. What is food security? And you may find a lot of technical materials, books, articles about that. But food security is simple means that everyone has sufficient amount of safe food. But when we look at the formulation and the framing of the food security in general, then food security means ensuring accessibility, affordability, and availability of the product. So everyone has a physical access to the product, but also have resources to afford that. And of course, during the pandemic, one of the issues that we faced and have to address currently and in the future is also the stable supply of foods, because disruptions in the global value chains resulted also in some challenges in different parts of the world, including this region. However, accessibility, affordability, and availability, and achieving them have to be done through the 3 pillars. The one is the self-sufficiency level, how much a country or region can produce to cover its own needs. And I've met few people and also read some materials about the situation after pandemic and how important it is to ensure growing local production. And why it is important, we should keep in mind that cooperation is still an important pillar, not only in terms of the food security, but the global cooperation at all. So it's really important not only to think about increasing your potential in terms of the producing your food, but also looking how to ensure that you're investing into the regional or global food security in general. So the second pillar, other than self-sufficiency and the domestic production, is imports. And I think Singapore is a great example when we see how flexible is the import and how diversified is imports of foods from different parts of the world that helps them to ensure food security in the country. And that's one of the reasons why Singapore is leading the global index of the food security. It's #1 food secure country in the world. And the third pillar is about strategic stockpiling. And in my opinion, strategic stockpiling is very important because for some countries and some regions, depending on the geopolitical situation, depending on the probability of different crises, depending on the number of people, the average growth of the population, and many other factors, you have to keep in mind that there is a need for some strategic stockpiles, reserves that just in case of the crisis, you can have something to cover some period of time, even if your borders are closed or if your country is isolated. But it's also important to look at how cooperation and partnership, what's the role of the cooperation and partnership in general, because again, going back to that argument about creating the food security in the region, it's really important what is the role of more developed countries and developed economies. Those countries that are producers of the technologies, what would be their role in terms of the contributing to the regional and global food security? And in this respect, I'd like to go to the second part of my address and my so-called short lecture, and that would be about what are the technologies that can help to drive efficiency, productivity, but also sustainability of the production within the countries and within the region. And you may see that there is growing investments and engagement of startups into the finding the innovative solutions. And if the second and third industrial revolution led to development of solutions such as agriculture machinery, chemical fertilizers, genetically modified seeds and stuff like that, then when we look at the fourth industrial revolution, we explore that things are a bit more difficult because it's not that easy to transfer those technologies, just because it also requires some literacy. So in this respect, we need to start thinking at first from the traditional measures of government support, and not only government support, but that's basically simply improving the physical infrastructure. It could be rural roads, it could be irrigation, then investing in ag education and integrating more technological trainings and courses into the universities and vocational schools. But other than traditional measures, of course, there are a few technologies that have the potential to transform agriculture within the countries, but also in the region, and in particular in this region. And the first one that comes to my mind is how digital technologies can transform the sector. And one thing which is important to keep in mind is that the fourth industrial revolution is about data. And therefore, we need to understand how to use the data in agriculture and food sectors to make it more efficient, productive, and sustainable. And precision agriculture is one of the solutions, and a solution where we see large tech organizations engaged, such as Microsoft Farmbase, for example, that provides cloud services, free services for many startups to develop their solutions. But also many organizations providing portfolio solutions. In other words, they provide an access to the satellite data. They collect data through all type of sources such as sensors, such as equipment, IoT, and then this data is gathered, analyzed. Of course, you can think about different algorithms. It could be machine learning algorithm particularly that collects the data, analyzes the data, and provides insights for farmers and agribusinesses, how to optimize their use of inputs, how to optimize their cost, and most importantly, how to increase productivity, how to increase yields on the farm level. And we see that those technologies are growing, and it's not only developed countries that are adopting them, although you can see that developed countries and larger organizations, it's easier for them to adopt them. But we see that those services are also affordable to the smallholder farmers, just because you don't need to make large investments, but you can buy, for example, subscription services. So one of the ideas is to build that infrastructure of digital farming all around the world and help the countries, developing countries in this region, to accelerate that adoption. And of course, there is an important aspect of education and integrating those teaching programs into the education, because we have to grow a new generation of farmers that are not really labor intensive, but the farms that you grow are farm managers. And those kind of digital technologies gives an opportunity for growing generation of farmers to adopt it, and it will attract more people into the agriculture in general. Then, of course, we can think about autonomous farming, because when you have the digital solution, you can always connect them to all type of automation, robotics, and ag machinery, and that brings your farm to a new level. That would be autonomous farms. Of course, this solution is more expensive at the moment, but still there are some companies that are providing such services. And gradually, in my opinion, we will move into the more autonomous farming mechanism, when you basically receive data, analyze data, then send the signal to the necessary machinery, and machinery does the rest of the work. Other technologies that, in my opinion, has a great potential, in particular considering the growing cities. We see that by 2050, according to the UN estimates, 67% of the global population will be living in the cities. And cities are getting bigger, larger, they attract more people. And therefore, urban and vertical farming has a potential at least to supply some type of the products, fresh products to the market. Because obviously the supply chains are getting more complex, and delivery of the fresh products are not that easy and cheap. And therefore, urban agriculture has a good potential to fill that gap as well. Other than urban agriculture, we think that alternative proteins is an area that can explore a massive potential and opportunities in the future. And when we speak about alternative proteins, there are many different startups, but also established businesses investing into this direction. And in my opinion, it could be synergized with the consumer behavior change. And I was reading an article very recently about the consumer preferences and behavior change within the millennials and Generation Z. And so people are really trying to get more, they really care more about sustainability of the production. Who is producing? Are there any exploitation behind a particular product? But also about ways how to minimize the impact on the environment and how to maximize the social influence of those technologies. And therefore, as consumer preferences will be changing and alternative protein technologies will be growing, in my opinion, there is a great potential of investing into these directions, and it would help us to increase and improve the food security within the countries, but also in the region. And finally, in my opinion, there are also interesting technologies that help us to deal with an issue of food loss and waste. Because obviously, whatever I spoke, it was about production. But when we look at the entire value chain, then we recognize that there is an issue, in particular in most of developing countries, in terms of the organizing, the harvesting, post-harvest, handling of the products, and you have huge amount of food loss. And by means of integrating some technology solutions, you can significantly decrease that. In general, there is different statistics, but in general, we can say that 30% of all food produced in the world is lost or wasted. And waste management is how we deal with the waste in the restaurants, in our houses, and elsewhere, and in the supermarkets, for example. And I'm really excited to see that there are many more startups that are trying to come up with the solutions on food waste conversion into other products. Or, on the other hand, also a more responsible planning at restaurant, supermarket level, but also in our houses. If we can invest in all those technologies, in all those developments, then I'm sure we would be able to meet all type of the goals in terms of the ensuring and improving food security within the countries and in the region in general.
All right, well, thank you, Armen. That was most comprehensive, and I think obviously for the purpose of setting the stage for this Nurture series of talks, that provides a fantastic overview of the state of play where we are in food production today and the role that technology and innovation can play. So thank you once again, Armen, for providing your thoughts. I have a few questions You mention, obviously, this fourth industrial revolution, the role that data and technology play in making our food system more efficient. But in my mind, a lot of the issues which you talk about and which we're sort of facing over the next 10, 20 years, these haven't really, in my mind at least, they're not exactly new issues. When you're talking about famine or poverty or the distribution of our resources around the world, I mean, surely these have been issues that society has lived with. Disparity between developed and emerging countries, and when you're talking about a third of the world's food production is lost sort of before it gets to market, etc. I mean, do you think that we are exploring these same issues in a new light? Are we simply just relabeling them, or is there truly something unique around what's happening today in 2020, which is bringing this conversation to the fore?
In my opinion, there is nothing new and nothing unique. It's a way that we frame the issue, and it's the way that some are trying to create this narrative that the new technologies are going to basically reduce the number of workplaces for people, for example, on one hand, because we still have 520 million farmers working on the ground. And obviously, some may think that as technologies will be penetrating into the developing countries where most of these smallholder farmers are producing food, they will lose their job. But and another narrative could be whether we can meet the objective of providing necessary amount of food to people by 2050. And according to the UN estimates, we're going to deal with up to 10 billion population. And those are the narratives, those are the arguments that have been made for a couple of decades. And people always kind of are concerned about the technologies and concerning about their future. But in my opinion, of course, there would be more people moving into the urban communities. And some of the people who live in the rural communities, those that are agile and those that are flexible and interested with the farming, it will provide them opportunity to expand their production by adopting new technologies. So it's going to be a balance. It's not something that's going to happen in one day or 1 year. It would be a gradual process where those farmers that are interested with the farming and are happy and ready to invest into these technologies, they will stay, they'll be more productive, they would produce enough amount of food to meet that global demand. And others would move to the urban communities to find a more vibrant economic life or a different lifestyle, right? And it's a normal process of economic development that we've seen for years and years, in particular when you look at the pattern in developed countries. So what we need to do is a more kind of a generic objective, how education is following these tendencies. So those people who are not doing agriculture, what other opportunities are engaged, right? And you may see that some experts are speaking about more importance of the more quantitative education because we're going to deal more with the digital technologies, and obviously there is a growing demand for that profession. On the other hand, some of the experts are speaking about soft skills, for example. In other words, the economies are adapting and evolving as well. What we need to do to accelerate this process is to help to adjust our education, adjust the way that we prepare the specialists, or provide some training for those who has the kind of a concern in terms of losing their jobs to get something new and more attractive, more interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, talked a lot about education there, as well as you brought up some sort of macro dynamics in play, such as sort of rural to urban migration. I think one of the statistics I saw was over the past 20 years or so, I think the population of smallholder farmers, or I should say the agricultural workforce in South Asia, has declined by over 25% or something significant. So clearly, as you mentioned, the role or the types of technologies which can be applied in the field, as well as the types of technologies that would be applied in the cities, whilst addressing the same sort of food security issues, are clearly going to be very different. I think, going back to your point about education, are there any gaps that you would identify today, whether it's in the context of Southeast Asia or back home in Armenia, where you would like to see greater development, engagement with broader society to subscribe to perhaps more sustainable or conscious consumer habits? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but...
Thank you. This is a really good question, because I think we need to rethink the way that we educate, because you can't really provide the exactly same program to everyone, because we now have an access to data. We can better understand what are the specific skill sets that a particular students may have, and how to tailor our programs to really try to straighten those skills that a particular person has talent or prone to. And in my opinion, that's very important. And when you look at this part of the world, in my opinion, that was a pretty good transition in terms of the migration from the urbanization process in general was very successful, and it's really natural, because some people are the result of that. I would say, as a result of the urbanization, we saw an unprecedented growth in this part of the world. And it's natural. We shouldn't really kind of be afraid that the number of farmers is decreasing, because at the same time, when we look at the productivity of the sector, and when you look at the amount of the food that we're producing, is growing, right? That means that we are investing in productivity. And although less people now engage in agriculture, they are producing more food. So there is nothing to be concerned. What we need to be concerned is how to tailor that education. And in my opinion, if we really focus on the agriculture and food systems, two reforms that we need to do in the area of ag education is to ensure that students are spending more time on the ground doing agriculture rather than sitting in the classrooms and learning it in the books. I think we need to increase that hands-on experience, that practical part of the education, and reduce the theoretical part. That's number one. Number two, in my opinion, is that we need to make agriculture universities more technological. In other words, how we integrate, how we train new lecturers in the university that have the ability to transfer that knowledge to the younger generation. Because it's so important how you teach. If you teach very traditional way, and that's a challenge that most of the developing countries are facing, it's more difficult than to adopt those technologies, because students are simply going and doing the same things that other older generation have done. So we really need to invest in creating these capacities at higher level education level and at vocational school. And most importantly, creating labs, providing opportunity for students to also test some new ideas, and then linking it to the advisory services, whether it's private advisory services or public advisory services, that no matter. But we need to have a chance of linking that: education, advisory services, and farms.
A lot of good suggestions there for any policymakers who may be tuning in today. Obviously, Singapore has made a lot of noise around the 30 by 30 campaign, but pre-COVID times, Singapore was hailed as a leader in food security. You in fact mentioned this in your talk, but obviously the recent experience with supply chain disruption, etc., has clearly changed that perception, at least with the epidemic's impact on food supply chains. What other notable shifts in the discussion around food security have you observed in ASEAN? And I think if I could just add to that, I guess, our experience here in Singapore, again, the government launched its 30 by 30 campaign 18 months ago, but it's really only sort of post-COVID that we're seeing more of these conversations happening on the ground, such as today on this webinar. So what are some of the other changes you've seen in ASEAN?
Oh, and I'll start with Singapore, because it was really impressive that in the new structure of the government of Singapore, we have now Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment. So it's basically the new name of the old ministry with a more emphasis on the sustainability. And I think that's a really good message that Singapore's government is sending to the world, that we're more committed to the sustainable agriculture and sustainable approaches in production in general, in terms of the contributing to the sustainable development goals. I think that's even from the perspective of the institutional change, was very important. The second thing that we really observe in this region is that there is more investments, not only within the countries, but between countries. In other words, more developed and richer countries in the region are making investments in other parts of it, in other countries, which I think is important. The third important thing is that one of our programs was an Accelerator program, and through that Accelerator program, we were recruiting startups to address challenges in different parts of the world. And I was impressed with the number of startups that comes from the ASEAN region, which is so important, because previously we got used to the fact that, most of the innovations, or where you have this nice acceleration program, you have so many different startups and entrepreneurs applying from the developed parts of the world. But now you see that there is more young people want to be engaged in shaping agriculture and food systems. And I think that's going to be the driver of the ag development. The 30 by 30, I think, is an excellent plan. It's well communicated. I really like that slogan that just because we have limited land, we're building the farms that grow into the sky. I really like that kind of a framing of the idea, of the objective of the government. But one thing which is really striking to me is how Singapore has managed in a very short time to create that Agritech and food tech ecosystem. And you see a number of organizations, venture investor firms, entrepreneurs and startups opening their offices, integrating their production or labs into that ecosystem. And I think that's one of the things that every country needs to consider, how to bring in knowledge and technologies into the countries. Because, one thing is to adopt technology. Another important thing is to really have your scientists, your entrepreneurs, your startups that producing the technologies that best fits to the needs of your country, whether it's geography, whether it's climate, or many others.
You mentioned the Cultivate program, I believe you were referring to. Perhaps you could share a little bit more information about that, how that's going, as well as one question is, does the UNDP have specific targets in addressing regional food and ag issues, which local or regional teams can support? And I guess the perspective here is perhaps from a more entrepreneurial angle. How can they work with UNDP in achieving some of these deliverables which you've set for yourself?
Excellent. In terms of the objectives, of course, we're trying to be, I would say, a facilitator, kind of bringing every stakeholder together to address the challenges that this region is facing. But also we're looking at more kind of a global approach, how to use this, how to leverage this Singapore's ecosystem to help other countries in the world to address, to transfer technologies. And in terms of the programs, we also try to build a good cooperation with those UN organizations that are very focused on agriculture and food systems, and obviously that's a Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So we're working closely with them. And just because they don't have the representative in Singapore, we're trying to also build that partnership and leverage their technical assistance, knowledge, and expertise in the field as well. In terms of the programs, so one of the programs is Cultivate. So it was the very first program that we've started here. And the idea was to really collect these challenge statements from 13 countries around the world, of course, ASEAN region, Africa and Latin America. And then we basically invited startups from around the world to apply and address those challenges. I'm very happy that we've partnered with AgFunder on that. And
thanks for the shout out.
And also a Grow Accelerator that helped us to choose, to interview, and to improve capacities of the startups. So we had more than 600 applications.
It was a fantastic result, and really enjoyed obviously being a part of that whole process. And I think to the point you made earlier, just the breadth of applications from truly across the world. Sorry, I'll let you continue. It's great.
Yeah. No worries. And yeah, we actually selected after 3 phases of selection. We are working now with the 31, and they're working with the country offices. We're connecting them with the governments and UNDP country offices. And as soon as situation improves and we can have that opportunity of ensuring the visits of the startups to the particular countries, we hope that some of them will start this established good working relationship with the UNDP country offices and governments and other stakeholders to pilot those projects. So that's one of the ways how UNDP envisages, Global Center envisages this transfer of technologies. Number 2 that we're working on is something that I mentioned right in the beginning, is digital farming. So we're designing a model project, and then we would start to communicate it through webinars and other channels to inform our country offices about availability of this technology, and then help them to really engage them into the development efforts in those particular countries. And finally, we're also working on one project which is pretty challenging and interesting, and probably most fascinating to me is how to use blockchain technology to ensure better food traceability and to improve the food supply chains. I'm not going to speak a lot about that, and actually we're planning to have a separate interview on that.
Yes,
so I think that would be a good opportunity to speak about that. But those are the kind of the 3 main areas that we're focusing on. But UNDP Global Center is really open for all type of cooperation. So if you have any good idea or any good initiative, please send us your messages. You can connect us through LinkedIn or going through our webpage. So please knock at our door. We would be very glad to look at the new opportunities of engagement within, of course, the mandate of the center.
Awesome. No, I think obviously what you guys are doing is really providing that sort of fresh perspective and unified coordination strength of an organization like the United Nations. Clearly, great work that's going on there, and obviously we're proud and honored to be part of that. Next question comes from actually one of our cohorts. Given a number of the current Singapore Food Bowl program are from Australia and New Zealand, and I suspect a number of our viewers today would be tuning in from overseas as well. How do you view the role of these 2 countries and historical food producers? How do you see them fitting into the security of food supply chain in Asia Pac and beyond? And is there a position for their sort of technology solutions beyond their immediate markets?
That's a very good question because, at first, in my opinion, the developed countries in general, and those are the really good examples, can help those countries in the region to significantly improve the productivity and efficiency of the production by means of transferring their technologies. And I think this transfer should be done by a joint private endeavors, by private sector investments into the ASEAN countries where there is a great opportunity, but unfortunately, due to the more kind of old-fashioned technologies used, those countries are not at their peak. So one thing would be to really promote investments of Australian and New Zealand organizations into those countries that have that need. I think because that would be beneficial for private sector organizations in Australia and New Zealand, but also beneficial. In other words, that's a win-win situation for everyone. And I think what is interesting about agriculture and food sector in Australia and New Zealand is that they've chosen a right niche markets, and the way that they're producing and positioning themselves as a higher value and value-added production is a good example for the region in general, because on one hand we see that there are many countries as a commodity producers. On another hand, we have more kind of a traditional food and food product production. But when you look at the premium market opportunities, when you look at the unique positioning, say an example, New Zealand, Manuka honey, right? It's a very high quality product, but also the way that New Zealand is communicating it is a very, very, in my opinion, right target. So if we can identify in this region, I'm sure every country has some unique product to sell to the region and to the world. And it can create an additional boost to the sector development. So I would say number one is promote investments with an idea of the transfer of technology. And number two, also look at the high value added production techniques that I think every country can adopt.
I think that's a great answer for insightful for many of the entrepreneurs, both in the existing cohort as well as tuning in today. Let me thank you for joining us here today, and on behalf of the rest of the Grow team and the audience online, thank you very much for spending your time. We will be providing Armen's contact details if you'd like to reach out to him, assuming that's okay.
That's fine.
So if you'd like to reach out to Armen for any follow-up conversations, as obviously he said, engagement with UNDP, etc., and the activities that they're doing here in the ecosystem. But for the time being, I will say thank you very much, and obviously we look forward to hosting you again for our next talk in the Nurture series, which is with Adam Lyle from Padang & Co. on the sustainability imperative. So I think, again, a nice segue from today's entry point on the discussion of our food system and sustainability. So thank you very much, Armen, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you again very soon.